All right, so are you ready to dive into a really interesting one today?
Absolutely. Always up for a challenge, especially when it comes to unpacking something as complex as Christopher Wray's departure from the FBI.
Yeah, I mean, the question on everyone's mind is, was he a grifter or was he gifted? I mean, was he a steady hand during some pretty crazy times, or did he ultimately cave under all the pressure?
Well, and what makes this even more interesting is that we're not just looking at a single incident or, one decision. We're really analyzing his entire time as the FBI director.
Yeah, this isn't about a single moment. It's like piecing together a puzzle, right?
Yeah.
Like, what decisions did he make? What pressures was he under? And then ultimately, how did all of that lead to his resignation?
Exactly. And the sources you've given me are, well, they really run the gamut.
Yeah, we've got everything from news articles that, lay out the timeline of events. We've got opinion pieces that are all over the map in terms of how they view Ray.
And let's not forget about the social media commentary. Some of it is pretty spicy and really reflects how the public felt about Ray.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And that's actually one of the things that makes this so fascinating to me. It's not just about what happened, but it's how people interpreted those events.
You've got it. And how different groups perceived him and the FBI as a whole, really.
Exactly. So before we get too deep into the weeds, I think it's important to take a step back and give our listeners some context. So who is Christopher Wray? How did he end up leading the FBI? What kind of background did he bring to this really high-profile job?
Well, Ray's resume is pretty impressive. I mean, he started out as a federal prosecutor back in 1997, and he steadily moved up the ranks within the Justice Department.
Oh, wow. So he's been around the block a few times.
He has, and his career really took off, especially after 9/11. He even ended up leading the Justice Department's criminal division under President George W. Bush.
So experienced law enforcement official, check. But how did he go from that to being the head honcho at the FBI?
Well, this is where things get interesting. In 2017, President Trump, he appointed Wray to replace James Comey. And, well, looking back, I mean, it almost feels like this clash was inevitable.
Oh, yeah, Comey. His name is pretty much synonymous with controversy. But for now, let's stick with Wray. When he was appointed, did people kind of raise their eyebrows? Like, was there any sense that this might not be a smooth ride?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, traditionally, FBI directors, they serve for 10 years. And that's not by accident. It's intentional. It's meant to protect them from, the whims of politics.
Right, because you don't want the FBI, which is supposed to be this impartial investigative body, to be swayed every time a new president comes into office.
That's exactly right. It's like a safeguard to make sure the Bureau stays independent. But with Wray, well, his situation was, let's just say, particularly tricky. And a big part of that was his relationship with Trump.
Yeah, that's no secret. I mean, things were tense between them from the very beginning, and some sources even describe it as downright hostile.
There was no love lost between those two, that's for sure.
And it went beyond just behind closed doors disagreements. We're talking public criticism from Trump, accusations that Wray was abusing his power, even threats to fire him. What were some of the key things that caused so much friction between them?
Well, one of the big flashpoints was the whole investigation into how Trump handled those classified documents after he left office.
Oh, yeah, the Mar-a-Lago raid. That was pretty unprecedented, right? In 2022, FBI agents actually searched Trump's Florida estate.
Yeah.
And that set off a firestorm of criticism from Trump and his supporters. A lot of them saw it as a politically motivated attack.
It was definitely a bold move, and the backlash was huge. It really fueled this idea that Wray was either acting on his own, going rogue, or, as some sources put it, working as part of the deep state to undermine Trump.
Deep state. Now, that's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but could you maybe break it down for our listeners who might not be familiar with it?
Of course. Deep state is kind of a catch-all term, often used by folks on the right, to describe what they see as this hidden network of government officials. And the idea is that these officials are working behind the scenes to undermine elected leaders. In this case, it was used to suggest that Wray and the FBI were part of some kind of conspiracy against Trump.
Okay, so it wasn't just about the classified documents, right? What other investigations are happening that added fuel to this fire?
Oh, there were a few. The FBI was also looking into Trump's efforts to challenge the results of the 2020 election, and then there were the allegations of Russian interference in the 2016 campaign.
So basically, Wray was leading the agency that was investigating the very president who appointed him. I mean, talk about pressure. And did his background, his own conservative leanings, did that complicate things even more?
Now, that's a really interesting question. Some sources suggest that, because Wray was seen as a conservative, he might have initially seemed like a good fit for the Trump administration, but it also put him in this incredibly difficult position where he was facing criticism from both sides no matter what he did.
So almost like he was damned if he did and damned if he didn't.
Exactly.
All right, so let's talk about the elephant in the room, Wray's resignation. On the surface, it seemed pretty sudden, even surprising. He had years left in his term. What did the sources say about why he really decided to step down?
Well, Wray said publicly that he was resigning to, try to prevent the FBI from being dragged even further into these political battles.
Yeah, and some sources, they paint this as a really noble move.
Yeah.
Like he was sacrificing himself to protect the institution he led.
Right, but then you have other sources that are much more critical.
Well, yeah, they call it an abdication of leadership. Like
Okay.
he basically just caved under pressure.
And then there's the timing of it all. I mean, it came pretty soon after Trump announced that he was planning to run for president again in 2024.
So that makes you wonder, was Wray trying to get out before things got even more heated?
It's definitely a possibility, and it's hard to ignore that angle.
Yeah, it adds another layer of complexity to this whole thing. So Wray steps down, leaves his power vacuum at the top of the FBI, and then who do they nominate to fill his shoes?
Well, that's where Kash Patel enters the picture. And he was a very strong Trump ally.
And I imagine his nomination didn't exactly go over smoothly with everyone.
Oh, you're right. It was met with a real mix of, I guess you could say, support and concern.
Yeah, concerns about, like, was he even qualified for the job? Would he be biased towards Trump? And some sources even went as far as calling him a Trump puppet. Like, he wouldn't really be leading the FBI, he'd just be doing Trump's bidding.
Those concerns, they weren't coming out of nowhere. I mean, Patel had been very vocal in his criticism of Wray.
And of other leaders at the FBI, right?
Exactly. And he often echoed that whole deep state rhetoric that was so common during the Trump years.
So you have Wray, who, at least to some, was seen as a steadying force. And he's replaced by someone who's viewed as much more partisan, much more aligned with Trump's way of thinking. That's a huge shift, and it makes you wonder, what does this tell us about the direction the FBI was heading in? Can an agency like that really stay independent in today's political climate? I mean, is that even possible?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to really grapple with that, I think we need to look more closely at Patel's background.
Okay, so let's do that. What was his story?
Well, his supporters, they'd point to his experience as a federal prosecutor and the work he did in national security, especially when he was in the Trump administration.
But I imagine his critics would say that's not enough to run the FBI.
You're right. They'd argue that that experience doesn't automatically qualify him to lead an agency that's as complex and as sensitive as the FBI.
So what did they point to?
Well, they brought up his lack of experience in managing large organizations. And then there was his history of making these really inflammatory statements.
Oh, wow. So not exactly known for his diplomacy.
Not exactly. And one opinion piece even went so far as to say that, Trump was deliberately trying to take control of the FBI by nominating Patel.
So the idea is that he could use the FBI to go after his enemies or protect himself from investigations.
Exactly. It's a pretty disturbing thought when you think about it, and it really raises concerns about what happens when law enforcement gets politicized.
Because if people see the FBI as just a tool for politicians to use, they're going to lose trust in it. And that's really dangerous.
It is. It's like a domino effect. And some sources argue that Wray's resignation, no matter what his reasons were, it kind of set a bad precedent.
Like it showed that even the FBI director isn't safe from political pressure.
Right. And it's not just the FBI that's facing this. It's happening across different parts of American society, the media, the courts, even science and academia.
It's like everywhere you look, these institutions that are supposed to be neutral, they're getting pulled into these political fights.
And social media just makes everything so much worse because misinformation spreads so quickly.
Oh, yeah. I mean, one of the social media threads we got for this deep dive was full of comments about how the FBI is corrupt and biased and part of some big conspiracy against Trump. It's clear that a lot of people have just lost faith in the agency. And it's not just the FBI that's facing this. It's happening across different parts of American society. The media, the courts, even science and academia.
Well, it's like everywhere you look, these institutions that are supposed to be neutral, they're getting pulled into these political fights.
And social media just makes everything so much worse because misinformation spreads so quickly.
Oh, yeah. I mean, one of the social media threads we got for this deep dive was full of comments about how the FBI is corrupt and biased and part of some big conspiracy against Trump. It's clear that a lot of people have just lost faith in the agency.
It's like we're living in two totally different worlds, each with its own set of facts and its own bad guys. How do we even begin to fix this? How do we bring people back together and restore trust in institutions that we need for democracy to work.
It's a huge challenge, there's no doubt about that. But I think the first step is just acknowledging that the problem exists. We need to be willing to have these tough conversations about what's going on.
And we have to be willing to listen to people who see things differently than we do. It's easy to dismiss them or write them off, but that's not going to help.
Right, we need to understand where they're coming from, even if we don't agree with them. And we need to hold our leaders accountable.
Yeah, make sure they're actually working for the public good, not just their own political interests.
Exactly, and we can't forget about being critical of the information we're consuming.
Like, don't just believe everything you read on social media.
Right, question your sources, look for different perspectives, and be open to changing your mind if you see evidence that contradicts what you believe.
So we've talked a lot about Trump, but Wray was also involved in some other high-profile investigations that put him in a tough spot.
Oh, for sure. One that comes to mind is the investigation into Hunter Biden, President Biden's son.
Oh, yeah, that was another one that got really politicized. What was the FBI looking into there?
So they were investigating Hunter Biden for possible tax violations and some gun-related issues.
And what happened with that?
He ended up being convicted on those tax charges, but then his father, President Biden, pardoned him. And that, of course, set off a whole other wave of outrage, this time from the other side of the political spectrum.
So you have Trump accusing Wray of going too easy on Biden, while others are saying he was unfairly targeting Biden's son. Talk about a no-win situation.
It really shows just how difficult it was for Wray to do his job. Every decision he made was going to upset someone.
Yeah, it seems like no matter what he did, someone was going to be unhappy. It really makes you think about how tough it must be to lead an agency like the FBI when things are so politically divided.
No kidding. And it brings us back to that big question we started with. Grifter or gifted? Was Wray a leader who tried to do the right thing in a really difficult situation, or did he let politics get in the way and compromise the FBI?
And looking at all these sources, it's hard to say for sure. I mean, there's evidence that supports both sides of the argument.
I agree, it's not a simple answer. It's complicated.
And maybe that's what's most important for our listeners to understand. Wray's story isn't just about him. It's about how divided we are as a country and how that's affecting our trust in these important institutions.
Yeah, it's like a cautionary tale about what can happen when law enforcement becomes a political football. We need these institutions to be strong and independent if we want our democracy to work.
So where do we go from here? What can we do as citizens to rebuild that trust and make sure the FBI can do its job without being influenced by politics?
Well, I think it starts with being honest with ourselves about the problem. We need to be willing to have these tough conversations and try and understand where people are coming from, even if we don't agree with them.
And we need to hold our leaders accountable. Make sure they're putting the country first, not just their own political party.
Absolutely, and we can't forget about being smart about the information we're consuming. Don't just believe everything you see online. Check your sources, think critically, and be open to changing your mind if you see evidence that challenges your beliefs.
This deep dive into Christopher Wray's career has been fascinating and, yeah, a little unsettling at times. I think it's safe to say we'll be debating his legacy for a long time to come.
Definitely. But even if we don't have a clear answer to the question of grifter or gifted, we've learned a lot about the challenges facing our country and how important it is to protect institutions like the FBI from political interference.
And with that, we'll leave our listeners with one last thought to chew on. In a world where information is so easily manipulated and trust is so fragile, what can each of us do to ensure that justice is truly blind and our institutions remain strong?